This is the DRF Players Podcast. Here are your hosts, Peter Thomas Fornatel and Jonathan Kinchin.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast, a special edition of the DRF Players Podcast, a TimeformUS takeover. This is show 385. It will be released to the world on Friday, November 16th, 2018. Truth be told, we are recording it on Wednesday, November 14th. If there's any strange dated references, that would explain it. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatal, back with you in the Brooklyn bunker once again, and happy to be joined as I was before the Breeders' Cup for this TimeformUS takeover by two special guests. We have returning to the program, Timeform's head figure maker, Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you today?
I'm doing good. I'm here in freezing cold Oklahoma City, just ready to talk some horses.
And not basketball today? You just want to stick to the horses?
Yeah, Thunder are playing okay. They're going to beat up on the Knicks tonight, but otherwise, it's still early.
Cold in New York, though. I imagine you're colder still. Speaking of New York and this great state of ours, I want to bring in an analyst from TimeformUS, who's made quite a name for himself over the last few years with the work he's done at that website, on the blog, at drf.com. He's David Aragona. David, how are you?
Doing pretty well. Finally recovered from Breeders' Cup week, and now we've got about a week in between and have some perspective. I think we're more ready to talk about it.
Excellent. Well, that's kind of why I wanted to do this. I originally was going to say we were going to button up the Breeders' Cup and sort of leave it with a bow, but I'm sure we'll continue to come back to it because I, for one, at least feel like there are still some open questions moving forward about how we're going to end up evaluating some of these races when horses come back and run, and how live races are going to be, and bias stuff to potentially follow up on. So the conversation will continue, but I did, with the benefit of just a little bit of extra hindsight, want to bring you both in. And David, we'll start right there. You say recover. Were you talking merely from the craziness of it all, or was it an emotionally draining Breeders' Cup for you as well?
Well, for TimeformUS, we had a lot of writing to do, a lot of analysis to do for the players package that we put together for Breeders' Cup Day. So just kind of like really getting deep into these races, and it's just kind of such a relief to actually see them occur and know what the results are after doing all that work. So just kind of you can be so in it when it's happening to just kind of have some time in between to look back and say to yourself, okay, well, letting go of what my opinions were going in, what do I actually think of these races as just horse races in retrospect?
Very cool. From a wagering point of view, and I'll ask both of you this, I'll start with Craig. How did it work out? How did it work out for you at the windows?
I had actually worked out very well. Started out with that first juvenile turf sprint, which we talked about, and hit the winner and a huge exacta. And, it's always kind of good to hit a big one first thing off. It kind of gives you confidence, which I think can be important as a bettor. And it just carried through. I had a pretty good weekend all through and through.
There are smart players with whom I've spoken who definitely believe that's right, that very early on sometimes you can get an idea of how the wind is going to blow, even for a short meeting like the Breeders' Cup. David, how about you? How did you end up making out wagering-wise?
Both days went pretty well for me. I like Jaywalk a lot in the juvenile fillies on Friday, so that kind of was the key to a lot of my multi-race wagers. And Saturday, the late races I thought were fairly logical. I liked the winner of the Breeders' Cup Mile, and the other races weren't too difficult to figure out around that.
Excellent. Let's talk about some of the analysis that you both did on the webinar that we did together and elsewhere. I'm going to ask you both one thing you would have liked to have the opportunity to do differently if you could go back and do it again in terms of your Breeders' Cup analysis. David, does anything leap to mind as one you'd like back?
I would say maybe the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I think I maybe upgraded the East Coast horses a little bit more than I should have. In retrospect, I can sometimes be a little susceptible to that East Coast bias. And Game Winner, just kind of watching all of his races again, he was way the horse to beat in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And, the race that he ran, I think really cemented that idea. He was just much the best there. And his races in California had really hinted at the fact that he might be the kind of horse that could continue to step forward as they stretched out in distance.
To be fair to you, though, didn't the scratch code of honor not being able to participate potentially make it a little bit easier than it would have been regarding Game Winner? Do you feel like that was as important of a defection as I did, and are you as excited as I am to see that one run going forward?
Yeah, I'm really not sure what to make of Code of Honor. I thought the Breeders' Cup was going to be a pretty pivotal race for him because we had learned quite a bit about him in the Champagne. We had learned that he could, rate behind horses and make that big run. I think we're still kind of waiting for some confirmation as to what the quality of the Champagne truly was, because obviously Complexity came back and did not run particularly well in the Breeders' Cup for whatever reason. It just seemed like he was a completely different horse at Churchill Downs. The third place finisher of that race, Call Paul, came back and lost to some very promising recent maiden winners in the Nashua at Aqueduct last weekend. So I think we're kind of just still waiting to see how good that Champagne was overall. But Code of Honor obviously ran very well within the context of that race. I don't really know about his distance limitations, but it's just unfortunate we didn't get to see him participate because it made the Breeders' Cup Juvenile a much easier race for the winner.
For sure. Craig, how about you? Is there one thing you either said on the record or did at the windows that you wish you had another chance to do again?
Yeah, I wish I wouldn't have been so forgiving for Promises Fulfilled and also for the names of Abel Tasman. Not that I loved Abel Tasman. I didn't. I was very skeptical, but I still was kind of afraid to take a stand against her when I think that last race probably told us all we needed to know. And Promises Fulfilled, even in the victory, he didn't look like the same horse to me that he did at Saratoga when he won at Keeneland, even though, he beat older horses, but he ran a much lower figure and he just didn't look as good. But I kind of let myself get talked into, he's got a big pace edge and kind of he was a big stand, a big play for me this week that didn't work out. And in retrospect, I probably should have been a little more discerning on that last race, saying, he didn't look the same and he's probably not going to bounce back. And really, he threw in the towel with no excuse, if you ask me.
Yeah, not a horse who there was as much positive buzz during the week as I expected. Still strong enough in the betting market, but as you say, just didn't appear to be that same form that we'd seen up north in Saratoga over the summer for sure. I want to talk about some figure making specifics over the weekend. But before we get to that, I want to ask the flip side of the coin of that first question. Is there something in your analysis that you were particularly proud of? I don't want you to, go crazy, knock yourself over, patting yourselves on the back here. But I think it is nice, especially if somebody else tees us up for it, to at least call out one opinion that you were proud of. Craig, I'll start with you.
It would probably be that Juvenile Turf Sprint. I was dead against the Euros. I had a feeling they were going to be overbet. I knew they were going to overbet the 2-year-old because he ran well at Longchamp on Arc Day, but he got a huge weight break. I followed European racing for a long time, and I just wasn't as blown away as what I heard a lot of people here be. And, the horse ran decent and had a bad trip, but I still think he was a horrible bet at the odds he was. And it gave us a lot of value on the American runners.
David, are you going to point to Jaywalk as one you're happy with in your analysis, or is there another moment that stands out to you as well?
I mean, as a horse player, there are the monetary victories and then just the moral victories. Sure. And for me, one of the moral victories that I was proudest of was actually the Juvenile Turf, which to me on paper was just a completely inscrutable race. I mean, there were so many ways to go. And I ended up settling on Uncle Benny and Some Like It Hot Brown, Some Like It Hot Brown being my top pick. And in some ways, I thought they did run two of the best races, even though they just barely lost to the winner Line of Duty. But just to have a race that's that complicated and have the two horses that you like finish in the top three, I think is, it made me feel somewhat vindicated.
And as an analyst, that's invaluable to the people listening. You don't put picks out there and make selections, and we don't on this show either, with the idea that someone's just going to blindly follow what we're saying. We're trying to give a perspective on a race that's maybe going to allow somebody else to include a horse in a spread race, or see that there's value and key underneath, or just by being able to point out horses like that as an analyst, you're absolutely doing your job. As a bettor, it can make you want to tear your hair out, of course, when you're almost right with a great opinion like that. But from an analyst point of view, I think that's worth underlining for sure. I've heard figure makers talk about how difficult the numbers were to make on Friday and Saturday. There's a great segment on the Steve Bick at the Races show. I still haven't listened to the whole thing, but Paul Matisse was on there on November 8th doing his sort of deconstruction of the Breeders' Cup. It's must-listen stuff. I know, Craig, you also were on there talking a little bit about this, as was Andy Beyer. But I was just curious to start the conversation anew. I'll just start with the easy one. How difficult of a Breeders' Cup was this to make figures for?
It was more difficult than normal. And, of course, California, it never rains out there during Breeders' Cup time. So it's usually a pretty straightforward exercise. Well, anytime you get a wet track anywhere that's rain during the day, drying out tracks, or tracks getting wetter, they just pose a lot more problems, because 9 times out of 10, the track is going to change throughout the day. I mean, if you're at the track, you can see them. They're always working on them in between. For days like the Breeders' Cup, the gaps between races are bigger. You have more turf races thrown in, so you may have an hour in between the races. So I think you really have to be careful and not just assume the track's staying the same, and not be afraid to just base one race on the horses in the race and treat it differently from the others. Personally, I thought Friday was a little bit easier than Saturday on the dirt. Turf was very tough both days. I mean, anytime the track is that slow, it's going to be problems. You mix in pace. What we might normally think is a slow pace is actually a fast pace when the track's a bog, and it can get pretty confusing.
Let's talk about Saturday specifically. How did you end up splitting out the races, especially where it appeared that either the track sped up or we just had two incredible performances in a row on the dirt, maybe a little bit of both, with between City of Lights run and Roy H's run. And then it seems like things, from my cursory look at a variant report, normaled out a bit later in the day once again. How did you end up treating Saturday throughout the day from a variant perspective?
Yeah, that's exactly how I did it. I thought the dirt races were slow early on, races 2 and 3, and then races 5 and 7 were just, the track was much faster. I had it. I could actually have my worksheet, so hoping I'd give you exact numbers. Between 10 and 15 points faster for those two races than earlier. And then and they were one-turn races, obviously, so they're a little bit different. And then the 3 2-turn races were not necessarily race 1. Race 1 fit in with the others, but races 9 and 11, the track was slow again. That was the Classic and the Distaff. And it kind of was verified in race 12 as well. It's not part of the Breeders' Cup, but we did get that little bit of extra data when they run another race. And it kind of told me, yeah, that track definitely slowed down again after the sprint. So, I don't remember off the top of my head I don't think it rained again, but whatever they did, the track definitely slowed down, in my opinion.
I was going to ask you, and then David, I want your perspective on this too, just as a horse player. I personally would feel so much happier with something logical, a more logical progression throughout the day, where you have, obviously in the morning there was more moisture in the track, the sun came out, time between races, enough breeze. The idea of the speed of the track going in one direction throughout that day makes perfect sense to me. It seems illogical to think that it would have slowed down again. I get what you're saying. Maybe there was some sort of manipulation done to it. I didn't see that personally, but we're all running around there. Could have easily missed something. As a figure maker, do you care if there's a reason that you can point to and a narrative you can identify, or do you just say, look, this is what the numbers are telling me, this is what I'm going to go with?
No, I definitely care. I always want to be able to quantify what, say why and have a specific reason. But unfortunately, we don't always get that. sometimes you can figure out a reason and sometimes you can't. But I've been doing this so long, and I've just kind of learned when I see something that sticks out, and I know if I don't make that assumption, I'm going to put out a silly looking figure that's going to come back to bite me and, get harassed on social media, which I don't mind. But, after doing it all these years, you just kind of learn, because most importantly, I don't want to make bad figures because people are betting on them, including myself. I'm betting them. They're a big part of my betting still. And, so you learn to be leery. You don't want to put a huge number out there that you're not sure of and, have somebody betting $500 on the horse and then have to turn around a month later and say, I think I blew that one. So, I do the best I can with the information that I have. And like you said, I always look to find a reason. But with wet tracks, it's really, really tough. So I tend to trust the horses equally, probably even more so than the clock. If all the horses in a race are telling me that this is a number, I'll trust that before I trust the clock.
David, from a player's point of view, how much do you pay attention to these sort of nuances, or are you just letting Craig do his job and taking figures at face value and going from there? How much does it factor in?
I mean, generally, I've never been one of those people that's so concerned about watching what the track maintenance crew does every second of the day, whether they seal a track between races or whether they're, back-raking the track at some point. I know it plays a role, but for me, I'm much more concerned with what happened than why it happened, and just kind of looking at kind of what Craig was alluding to. Do figures make sense for the horses in the race? And I guess that's a lot easier to do with these Breeders' Cup races, where generally horses have done a lot to even get to this point. So you have some expectation of what they're supposed to do on Breeders' Cup Day. But yeah, for me, I'm really concerned in assessing numbers and looking at how figures came up, just, deciding which figures are most plausible and most reliable for horses in a given situation. And sometimes you'll see a figure that looks a little bit odd, and it could be plausible because, horses just do improve from time to time and will change their patterns. But you do want to kind of have an idea of which figures are reliable for you and which are a little bit less reliable, and keep that in mind as races are run and as you assess these horses again moving forward.
And Timeform gives a few tools. I'll do a plug here. Timeform has a few tools that will help out with that, not only identifying figures that maybe, Craig, at the end of the day, you don't have as much confidence about. But I love how in the chart view, you can see not only the figure earned on the day, but what those horses typically run. Very easily presented data in the chart view on Timeform that can sort of let you make your own assessment. And you can also see going forward, coming out of the race. And that's sometimes where it will become actionable to me. If you see a certain race for whatever reason, and all the horses coming out of the race are running notably lower than the figure in that race, well, that's not another horse coming out of that race isn't one I'm going to be eager to make a play on just based on the figure. I'm going to view it with a little bit of skepticism. As a figure maker, Craig, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm picking on you when I say that, but it is fair to say that sometimes for reasons out of our control, out of your control, you're just not going to be able to produce as reliable a number as others. Yes.
Oh, definitely. I do the same exact thing you do. I scroll through and see, and David and we talk about races all the time, particularly on the NYRA circuit, where, he'll point out, hey, I don't think this figure's holding up. They're not running back. And he doesn't just do that. He gives me reasons and gives me some good data. And it's not always too slow either, or too fast. He'll say sometimes it's too slow. I think Jaywalk was a good case of that. He pointed out that race. He thought it could have been faster. And, I actually agreed with him. It definitely could have been a faster number. So, yeah, there's nothing wrong. This is definitely more art than science. And there are some tough decisions to make when you do make the figures. And you do the best you can. But I think you have to evaluate, all the information you have when the race is over. When you're looking to bet a horse, yeah, there's nothing wrong with going back and looking and saying, hey, this figure, maybe it's a little shaky, or, maybe there's some reasons to question it. I do it myself, so I certainly would expect others to.
And the buyer team famously will change figures retroactively to give the public the best information at the time. What's the TimeformUS policy about revising figures after someone like David or someone like yourself notices there might be something that's a little bit off?
Yeah, if there's a clear mistake, definitely we will go back and fix them. I probably don't do it as often as I should, to be honest. I try to be very picky in those spots. I don't want people betting on a horse based on a number and then they go back next time and see it's 10 points lower. I have to be pretty darn sure before I'll make a change. But when the decision's made, I will definitely do it.
I want to talk about the turf racing from a figure point of view. You mentioned how difficult that is. I would imagine a lot of that has to do with the course condition, which was, I think it's safe to say, softer than a lot of the turf racing we see throughout the year. How does soft turf affect the figures that you eventually make for the Breeders' Cup?
Well, we actually do things a little different than some of the other people in that we adjust how we make figures depending on the course condition. Yielding races on soft and yielding tend to be a lot more gapped out than they are on firm, where finishes are tight. So, just as I don't know the math right off the top of my head, but a horse that loses by 2 lengths on a firm course might be 5 points behind the winner, whereas on a yielding course, it might only be 2.5 or 3 points. We definitely take that into consideration. And it also kind of changes our speed charts as well. So it's you can't use your, if, for instance, the turf was run at 5.5 furlongs. That relationship we're looking for between the different distances, say the 1 turn or 2 turn mile and the 5.5 furlong sprint, what we might consider this is our baseline 100 figure, that gap changes as the course condition changes. So that's why we probably came up. I mean, I saw a lot of talk about these huge figures for the turf sprint. I gave it a good figure. I'm not buying that those are the best turf horses we've ever seen. So I went a different route than I saw like Beyer and Thorograph and some other guys go. But yeah, it's just, you got to use all the tools that you have. And we've studied the conditions and found that you definitely have to treat turf different. Dirt for this, is the same, but not to the same extent as turf, where, you just have to be creative and figure out what's really going on and not be stuck in a certain mindset where 2 lengths equals 5 points or 1/5 of a second equals 2 points. You got to be able to adjust.
That makes sense. When you think about it, a strung out field often indicates a big number, but you see a lot more strung out fields. Watching plenty of UK and Irish racing, as we all do, you see a lot more strung out fields over there, and it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. So I think that approach is extremely sensible. David, I'll ask you not specifically about the figures, but just about the soft turf handicapping in general. Do you feel like you learned anything to add to your arsenal as a player about these softer courses you might get in a Breeders' Cup, an Eastern Breeders' Cup late in the year? Was there a lesson you took away from watching as many good races on this kind of ground as we did over the weekend?
I think what Craig said is very insightful, that you do often see much larger gaps between horses on turf courses that have taken some rain. And I think the turf sprint is a great example of how that can be problematic because, look, Stormy Liberal and World of Trouble ran fantastic races, but, I didn't look at the specifics of what Beyer gave them, but they're probably about 20 points faster on figures than Disco Partner on this specific day. And look, they're not 20 points faster than Disco Partner on most days. I think Disco Partner lost last year's turf sprint by less than a length. These horses are much closer in terms of ability. So not that either speed figure is necessarily wrong because the horses ran the races that they ran on this day. It's just, what does it really mean in the grand scheme of things? If these horses ran back against each other, let's say in some imaginary race later in December, how would you really assess them? Or if you're assessing horses for awards at the end of the year, I don't think Stormy Liberal is is the best turf sprinter that we've seen in the past decade, or is some, massively dominant horse in his division this year. I think that the way this race was run and the fact that he handled this course just kind of played to his strengths. And this race is not necessarily a reliable indicator of how good these horses are compared to other horses in the division. It just indicates that they ran fantastic races on this day, and they might not be predicted moving forward.
It's a good point, and we'll see. And you're right about there being plenty of figure disagreement about this race, and we'll have a lot more data hopefully going forward. But I think that the time form perspective that you guys both bring to the conversation is a valuable one and worth considering for sure. Let's talk about surprising performances at this year's Breeders' Cup. And David, I'll start with you just to give you an opportunity to call out one performance that you didn't see coming.
I'd probably have to go with the filly and mare sprint. That wasn't one of the races that was assigned to me to really, do a deep dive into and write up. But I did handicap it, and I'm the kind of handicapper that relies a lot on speed figures. I generally will steer away from horses that just appear to be a little bit too slow to me. And I know that there were some things to like about the winner and the fact that she was moving in the right direction at the right time. Just to me, she looked a little bit slow to make on paper, and it just turned out to be a very slow race across the board. All of the horses that looked like they were capable of running much faster figures just did not show up and run those races on the day. So I think it allowed a horse that might have been slightly inferior in most years to win the race, and it was just a blanket finish. That's not a race that I was anywhere close to. And it's also a race that throws a real monkey wrench into, what you're going to make of the end of year awards at the Eclipse Awards, because that's a category that just really has no clear leader.
I hadn't even thought about that yet. That is a mess. And as you point out, with that blanket finish, in so many ways, I mean, to me, it's simplistic, I suppose, but just a tale of trips. A lot's been made of the Herrera Ortiz brilliant ride and perfect trip on Shamrock Rose compared to what happened to Showing, compared to what happened with Marley's Freedom. And voters are going to have a lot to decide between in that one, that's for sure. Craig, how about you as far as a surprising performance on the weekend?
It sounds kind of funny to say, being he was only 5-2, but City of Light really surprised me. I thought he'd run okay, but I was kind of against him in this spot, especially when he drew the rail, and he just ran lights out. I mean, there's not a whole lot you could say. He ran a big number. He set a fast pace. He was pressured a little bit earlier, and he was right up there with one of the best horses we saw all weekend.
I was surprised to see that at least the first part of that race not coded red on time form. It must have come awfully close. That's the great thing about being able to look down and see the running lines. I've got it here. 152 is the number I have for the first pace number for City of Light. That must have come awfully close to being coded red. Yes. Yeah,
I think it was actually 1 point away. So I'm pretty sure off the top of my head that it's a 27 point at that distance. Codes that one red. But yeah, it was. But you see, from there, it really, it was a solid pace, 138, 136, finished in a 126. So, it was definitely not an easy trip. He earned everything he got there, but just barely missed being coded red, as you say.
To me, that was one of and I've pointed this out on the show before, so apologies to listeners for repeating myself, but I loved the Castellano ride and the tactics. I just thought, especially after not breaking so sharply last time, to be able to get the horse in a rhythm. And I did hear Paul Matisse mention on the Big Show that he thought in a contrarian way, maybe drawing the rail was actually a good thing, in that it just clarified the tactics and made them just say, hey, we're going to go hell bent for leather. And those tactics proved to be the winning ones. This would be one of the horses where there'd be a little bit of disagreement, I suppose, in the end, figure-wise, with your figure, Craig, being a little bit lower than what the buyer came back, at least unadjusted for pace. So that's interesting to me that this is one you call out, even though I'm assuming you tempered it. You tempered what the figure would have been a little bit.
Yeah, it's he got a 130, and that was 4 points where bonus because of the fast pace that he set. But, looking at the whole field like you do in the charts, I have no problems with the figure. I don't think the ones behind ran very well. Catalina Cruiser obviously had run some huge numbers coming in, but he clearly wasn't himself. So I wouldn't expect him to be anywhere near where he had been. But looking at the top four, Seeking the Soul ran a point faster than he had the time before. Bravazzo stepped back up to running a 120, which he hadn't hit in at least a few races. Forensic Fire ran basically what he's been running. So I didn't really have a hard time with that race at all.
Looking at the array of numbers, the logic feels unassailable, I must say. Let's talk about horses to bet back coming out of this year's Breeders' Cup. Now, obviously, the question is complicated by a number of factors, including not knowing who's going to be running where, in some cases, even if horses are going to be given another chance to run. But I'm just curious to get your gut of a horse that you're excited about wagering on next time they appear. And if you don't have one and you have one that you're excited to bet against next time, that'll do as well. Craig, will keep it with you.
To bet against, for sure. I don't know if he's retiring or not. Like you said, I got to follow all our cohorts at DRF to keep up with that stuff. But it would be Gunnevera. I will look forward to betting against him each and every time he runs. He pretty much got a dream trip once again. And, I don't have any problem going against him at what'll be a short price. Maybe he'll show up in Dubai or the Pegasus or one of those spots. The horse that's really impressed me of late and one that I would want to bet again is probably Nick's Go. I had a few bucks on him in the juvenile this year, and he looked good for a while there, and I think that's where he's really turned a corner. You can see it numerically and just watching him since he went on dirt. I mean, he's looked really good the last two, and I think this horse has a lot of promise.
Interesting points both. And Gunnevera, I'm a huge Gunnevera fan, but I get what you're saying. You're talking about a horse coming from a race thoroughly coated red, closing, getting a great setup for the late run, coming back. And I would assume the Pegasus will be next on the docket. Obviously, very different situation, even without knowing who's running there, just Gulfstream playing so differently to Churchill typically. And with the big fancy 2 at the end of the Breeders' Cup Classic, you can just see the betting action not being anywhere near the 30-1 for Gunnevera this time around. David, I'll go ahead and ask you the same 2 questions. Do you have one for us you're interested in betting back and maybe one to bet against?
The one to bet against, I would say, is probably Shamrock Rose out of the filly and mare sprint. I don't know how much respect she's really going to garner off this win, but it was, like you said, a fantastic ride by Arad Ortiz to, get her from last to first in that race in a traffic-filled field. And I'm just not sure how much that win really means in the grand scheme of things moving forward in that division. It's not the strongest division by any means. We'll see who pops up next year. But I assume she's a horse that will be around next year. And I'm just not 100% sure that she really is, the leader of this division. The horse that I'd want to bet back, who I actually think watching these races back, I didn't fully appreciate how well she ran when I first saw these races, is Wildcat in the distaff. She, to me, probably should have won that race. I don't want to say that a horse like Monomoy Girl was lucky to win, because Monomoy Girl just always seems to find a way to win these races. But Wildcat, I don't know what exactly happened at the start. She just kind of steadied out and just was much farther back than you would have expected. But the pace of that distaff was not fast by any means. I think they actually got a little bit faster on pace figures as the race went on. The pace was slower than the Classic, slower than the juvenile races on Friday, the day before. So I think that really favored Monomoy Girl's style to be up close to that pace. And for Wildcat to come from as far back as she did, to encounter some traffic at the top of the stretch, she was really the only horse that made up that kind of ground in the race. I know she was a horse that Chad Brown had liked a lot when he initially got her in this country, and she just kind of didn't really run that well at Saratoga and had disappointed. The Beldame that she won, it was a weak field, but she was visually impressive in doing it. I think she's a horse that's finally coming around, and maybe it just took her a little while to acclimate to U.S. racing, but to me, she ran the best race in the distaff, and she could be a real force in that division next year.
I love that point. I'm going to throw one out as one I'm interested in betting back. And just to preface this, we haven't worked all that much together, but do know I have thick skin. So feel free to come at me with this one, because I know a lot of people, for whatever reason, don't like this horse. But I've been a defender throughout his career. And I'm talking about, though, of course, not when he won at the Breeders' Cup last year. I'm talking about Mendelssohn. I was very impressed, and I think that the pace numbers bear out the impression I had watching the race visually. I felt like Mendelssohn's run in the Classic, given the hot early pace, I could almost describe it under other circumstances as a winning, the type of effort that would win a lot of races, with different, obviously having to go much more even pace early, as opposed to coming blazing out of there. But I'd be very interested in a race like the Pegasus if it comes up with where he's a horse we can expect to comfortably make a lead this time, unlike the last two times. And maybe the narrative of him as an underachiever takes hold, and you could get, it's so hard to talk specifics of prices, not knowing who's going to show up, but the numbers that popped ahead were, 10 to 1 on a horse like that. I'm looking for one of you to tell me I'm nuts, or give me a little bit of affirmation. Craig, we'll start with you. You seem like somebody who's gonna rain on my parade on this one.
No, I think, he's a decent horse. He's talented. I'm not altogether convinced he's still not better on turf. My one reservation about him is he still hasn't run particularly fast outside of the Dubai race, where I think we can all agree he was kind of on a golden rail. And just, had an easy lead, faced absolutely no competition that day. But, otherwise on my figures, his Classic was actually his best yet, which is a 124, which is solid, but it's still just a grade 2 number. So unless I'm really expecting him to jump up at 4, and get 5 to 10 points faster, which can happen, I'd be a little leery of him at what, he's probably not, he's going to get bet every time, given his reputation, I would think. So, like you say, it depends on who shows up and who he's in against, and maybe he could get an easy lead. But, he's probably not getting an easy lead in the Pegasus with $10 million on the line. So, I'd be against him personally.
David, your thoughts on Mendelssohn going forward?
I've actually got to push back on Craig on this one. I completely agree with you, Pete. If you had said back in the springtime that Mendelssohn would end this year being an underrated horse, I don't think anybody would have believed you, because he was so dressed up off that UAE Derby win on that gold rail. And, he had looked like a complete fluke when he came back and didn't show up at the Kentucky Derby. I just have to, first of all, commend the training job by Aidan O'Brien, who set out a plan for this horse after the Derby, wanted to show this horse's true ability by the end of the year. And even though he didn't really take down any of these big races, the fact that he was able to set the pace in the Breeders' Cup Classic, which had so many speeds signed on it, he beat them all to the front and led for most of the way. I mean, that alone in of itself is pretty impressive. And, I know the speed figures don't necessarily suggest this, but I would go out on a limb and say that Mendelssohn ends this year as the best dirt 3-year-old going Classic distances out there, because the race that he ran in the Breeders' Cup, I was impressed by. I mean, they had to use him to get to the front, and he set a very fast pace, and he did kind of fall apart at the end, but I thought he stayed on relatively well considering the circumstances, how horses like Gunnevera were so helped by the pace. His race in the Jockey Club I thought was just fantastic. I don't even think we rewarded enough, even factoring in pace into the speed figures, going the distances of like a mile and a quarter, as we do in the sprint races, where we give horses a huge bump for setting very fast paces. But you have to remember, him and Diversify, they opened up about 10 lengths on that field in the early going. So I really thought that Mendelssohn ran a fantastic race in that Gold Cup. And for my money, he's just run some of the best races back-to-back that we've seen out of any of these 3-year-olds in the Gold Cup and the Classic. And I don't know if he's going to get the right pace setup if he does show up in the Pegasus, but I think he's a horse that really does have the ability to win these top races. I don't know where people are getting this. I've heard a lot of people argue that he's a better horse on turf. I don't know where that argument comes from. Show me one of his turf races that's even remotely good as one of these dirt races. I mean, he got a fantastic trip and ride when he won that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf last year. To me, that wasn't even that great of an effort. He has taken a huge step forward on the dirt, which is the surface he's bred for. And I just think Mendelssohn is a really cool horse. I don't know if he's ever going to get his day to really shine, but he's a horse that is, for my money, underrated at the end of the year, because he's just run so well and hasn't really had, that glory.
It's interesting, and he's a funny horse because I know what Craig is saying when he talks about, well, he's got this name and he'll quite possibly be 2-bet. But then you look back at some of the prices he's been throughout this year, and he's outrun his odds on multiple occasions. So he's a funny horse where if he becomes sort of the story of the race, I could see that narrative driving the price down, as Craig is afraid of. But I could also see a scenario where there's people are looking at the form and the story is Accelerate trying to go back-to-back Pegasus Breeders' Cup where he actually, and people just sort of write off the 3-year-olds as a group from this year, where he actually ends up being that decent price once again. Hopefully everybody stays healthy and we get to continue this debate in a race like the Pegasus. And I'll say this, I agree obviously with David's point about the dirt over the turf. But even if there was any question about it, I just think that from a breeding, prestige, marketing your future stallion point of view, I just don't see what the turf does for him at this point. I think the grade 1, even the grade 2 win not in Dubai on dirt just means so much for him that if assuming everything stays right and he stays in training next year, that's what we're gonna see a steady diet of. You feel like rebutting any of this stuff, Craig? Or are you ready to move on?
No. Like I said, my biggest concern with him was value. I'm not sure going forward we're going to see a lot. I'm not going to argue against him being the best 3-year-old at the end of the year, but putting on basketball terms this year, that's kind of like winning the G League. I think. It's a. Who else was our Lone Sailor finished, the next one behind him? If Lone Sailor's your competition, you probably should be the best. So we'll see. I was really impressed with his Jockey Club Gold Cup. I guess visually it was easier to see. He was, kind of hung right there at the finish, where he gave up a little bit earlier this time. But, he did get actually an even bigger figure by a point from me. So, I'll keep my eyes open and see who shows up and how the race looks, particularly on our pace projector, because I think if he gets pressured, he'll have a hard time with these guys. But if he could slow it down and he's 10-1, maybe I could be convinced.
I like you're at least giving an inch there. That's very, very kind. I just want to see what this horse would do with Justify's Belmont trip. Something just to be able to just run, if he could get at a spot to run efficiently by himself with how much he's grown up. But that's probably enough on Mendelssohn, a pet horse of mine. So I spend too much time. I want to talk about one of the great things about TimeformUS is the ability to compare the ratings apples to apples on the European runners. I just wanted to take both of your temperatures about where you feel where you feel like the Timeform product is most useful for evaluating foreign horses, and where maybe you still have to do a little bit of digging on your own. And what I mean by that, I still feel like looking at a race like the Turf, I had to manually upgrade a little bit the horses coming out of the arc, say, I wasn't sure if the ratings reflected just how good of a race that was and how big some of those efforts were. And maybe that's just me, and maybe I got lucky and the numbers do a better job in aggregate. But I was just curious to talk to you guys both about how you use TimeformUS to evaluate the shippers, particularly with the Breeders' Cup so recently in the rear view. Craig, I'll start with you.
I use the numbers as a rough guide. I mean, you said the numbers themselves were comparing apples to apples, but the way they're made are apples to oranges. I do think they're very good. I'm not knocking them at all. I love the Timeform ratings. What I am leery of is when horses ship over, and you don't see it so much for the Breeders' Cup, but a lot of cheaper horses ship in here. You'll see them showing up in Chad Brown's barn, and they have really low numbers. And I think you just have to be careful of those, because a lot of times they're bleeders or they've had issues over there. So, if I see a horse shipping in with 80s running a field against a field that runs 110s, depending on who the trainer is, who's riding, I'm not going to be afraid to use that horse because of the ratings. And my only point about the numbers is I'm not going to bet a horse because he has a 128 versus somebody else in the field having a 126. I consider something like that virtually even. I think Enable, like in this case, her figures looked a little low, but if you considered it was her third off the layoff, I took a shot against her just coming back so fast and having such a light workload this year. But, I don't think you could have bet against her based on the numbers. And that's my thing. I've seen somewhere you can. I'll see these horses shipping in and you know what they are. They've been here before. And I'm not afraid to throw those out. It's the unknowns that you have to worry about.
David, some thoughts on handicapping the European runners coming out of this year's Breeders' Cup with Timeform?
Yeah, I think what Craig said about, and he knows even more than I do about the nuts and bolts of how the Timeform ratings are created. But I do think you have to kind of assess what the utility is of those and how they're used in Europe as opposed to how we're using speed figures over here. And it is a little bit different. For instance, Enabled figures did look a little bit low, but I think what you really have to do is compare her figures to other 3-year-old filly figures that are given out in Europe. And she's just vastly superior, even 4-year-old filly figures, vastly superior to other horses that are female that run in those races, because obviously, generally those horses receive slightly lower numbers. I even think she had the same arc number as Waldgeist in the Breeders' Cup Turf, even though she beat that horse because of the way those numbers are given out. So in that context, Enable is a superior filly, female racehorse. And the numbers over here, I think they do sometimes look a little bit lower than our speed figures, but I also think that's right to generally, because European horses that are coming over here, especially for races like the Breeders' Cup, they're coming into a new environment. They have to run on a different surface, different configuration. They're at a bit of a disadvantage. I don't think it would work quite as well if we were using American figures over in Europe, because generally those horses are going to not run their optimal races over their courses. So I do think generally our numbers being a little bit higher for really top horses, it does make sense in these kinds of races. Also, what I find especially valuable, aside from just the raw numbers in TimeformUS PPs, is the commentary that you get for the European races, especially in England and Ireland and a little bit in France. Just the in-depth commentary of how a horse ran in a race, what the horse's career trajectory is coming into and going out of that race. There's like a little paragraph written about every race that a horse runs. And I found information to be really valuable because you kind of get a sense of how a horse was assessed over there and what was really expected of a horse, the kind of potential that he was expected to fulfill or not fulfill. And that can be really valuable, kind of assessing why a horse came to this country or what they're going to really excel at once they do come to this country.
Those great points. And that type of narrative that we sometimes create ourselves through the past performances, starting with an old race and coming through the present, you can have that done in words. And you can do it. You no longer have to go ahead and download the timeform.com race card for Breeders' Cup like we did in the old days, or worse yet, send away for the physical cards. You can now get that as part of TimeformUS. Something David said put a thought in my head, and I should know the answer to this. I don't know. I believe there was a TimeformUS style card done for the ARC Day this year. Is that right, Craig?
Yes, there was. And it just said, for all the foreign races, it had the Timeform rating along with the comments, which I can't believe I left that out. Even above the numbers, that's what I go to first. I love reading the commentary and seeing what the analysts say. Luckily, David picked right up on that. But yeah, we did that. And then I don't remember if there were any horses shipped. There were definitely horses on ARC Day that had some North American running lines. So those that did had our figures and our traditional running lines in there. But yeah, we had the whole ARC Day card there.
How difficult is that to do going forward? Is it possible for a meet like Royal Ascot that's obviously really cemented itself in the USA horse racing fans' imagination over the last few years with so much added North American participation? Is there a chance we could see that again for a meet like that?
Our tech guy Dan would probably groan a lot if I committed to anything here. I know we do the Dubai World Cup card, and we did ARC Day. I'm not going to commit to anything beyond that. You'll have to talk to Mark Attenberg on that one.
Gotcha. Fair enough. I apologize for asking that question and putting you in the position of having to answer it, but I was just getting excited because I think especially when there's more cross-pollination with our horses going over there, like David was suggesting in his question, there could be some potential for some fun stuff. I wanted to ask you about this project we've discussed a little bit in the past. This would have been probably a good question to piggyback when we were talking about soft turf earlier, but these additional designations you're considering for turf races, because of course not all turf with the same designations are created equal. What's the status of that project, Craig? And can you tell us a little bit more about how you envision it working?
Okay, yeah. It's actually, I've implemented it on my end. We just have to get with our tech guys and get them to put it into the past performances. And it's actually for dirt and turf, where we're going to tell you how fast it is. But instead of using traditional, yielding, firm, fast, good, whatever, it's just going to be strictly numerical, 1 to 10, where 1 was Preakness Day turf. I don't know if you remember the bog that was. I mean, it made Churchill look like a paved highway. Churchill on Breeders' Cup weekend. That would probably have been a -5, to be honest. It was so slow. But we're only going down to 1. And then 10 is, the rock hard stuff where you can't tell that it's not a dirt course, basically. Or just, Belmont gets really firm. And all we're doing there is I'm trying to take into consideration the speed of the track, but we also build in things like, Belmont's a faster track than Aqueduct because it has wider sweeping turns that don't slow the horses down, the outer. So we're taking in the geometry of the track. I'm not just, if it's a real slow pace race, you're not going to see me say the track is slow because the time was slow because of pace. So taking a lot of different factors in there. And I'm not trying to say we're going to be deadly accurate, but you'll also get a better feel. Like I think they labeled these turf courses at Churchill for the Breeders' Cup as good, and I don't think many people bought that one for a second, looking at the times of the races and how they were run. So instead of seeing good, you're going to see 4. Whereas a couple days later, a track that was labeled good over the same surface but is actually much firmer. Instead of both seeing good, you might see one's a 4 and one's a 7. And particularly on turf, I think you're going to see horses have a clear preference as we get more and more data on that. I think it applies on dirt as well. I think there are horses that like a really firm dirt course, and there's others that like a lot more cushion. And, as these things get put in the PPs and we get some more data and a bigger sample size, we'll be able to see the results.
It sounds fantastic. I can't wait to check it out. It will correlate pretty closely to the variance.
It does, but like I said, I can't rely totally on the variance because there's a lot of, especially on turf, there's a lot of things that it can influence time. But the variants are definitely a big part of it, no doubt about it.
David, is this something a curiosity for you, or something you're really looking forward to in your upcoming form study?
Oh, I can't wait for it to be implemented. For me, I'm a big believer in this approach because, I mean, if you're watching as many races as we do and really kind of, handicapping as much, I think you kind of have to realize that a lot of these turf ratings that we get are basically meaningless. I mean, I don't want to be too harsh, but it seems like every jurisdiction has a different standard for how they rate their turf courses. I mean, it could rain for a whole week at Gulfstream and they still rate the course good. So, I mean, you might see like a -60 variant course and it's still rated good. It just doesn't make any sense. Whereas, at Belmont, the turf course could be rated good, and it might be running times that are just a second or two slower than normal. So I do think kind of evening out this playing field, because you do have so many horses shipping from one track or one circuit to another very often these days, and it's hard to really make sense of, what is yielding at Keeneland might be good at Belmont. So just to be able to have those on an even playing field and be able to make those comparisons, I think is going to be really valuable to a lot of horse players.
I'm not going to make the mistake, Craig, of putting your feet to the fire again and asking you point blank when we'll be able to see these on the commercial side. But if you were to have a guess, does it feel like the early 2019 might be possible? I won't say any more than might.
Yeah, I'm going to push my boss for January 1st. So we'll see what they can do with that. This is just a matter of displaying one number. So hopefully it won't be a huge project, but as a hack programmer who only knows enough to get myself in trouble, I don't want to commit anybody else to stuff. without knowing what's involved.
I like it. Time for just a couple more quick questions. We are running out of time in an hour that absolutely flew, thanks to the excellent stuff that you two bring to the table. Let's talk about who we see as the biggest star of this year's Breeders' Cup. What's the first horse or human who comes to mind for you, David?
I mean, I guess Newspaper of Record is the big breakout star that might have been on a few people's radars going into the Breeders' Cup, people that really follow New York racing and had paid attention to her maiden victory and her win in the Miss Grillo, kind of knew that she was a special talent. But I think the entire world got to see what a special horse that she is on that Breeders' Cup Friday. And I am very excited about her, especially moving forward to next year. Chad Brown even hinted that she might be a horse that they could take over to Europe, and I think she is the perfect kind of horse that you'd be able to have success over there with as an American connections, because she's got those strengths that we've seen other American horses that were successful in Europe also possess. She's got that tactical speed, because you're often not going to outsprint these Euros to the wire in a lot of these races over there, but she's got the ability to make the running and to kind of push the pace and take other horses off the bridle early. So to me, she's just a huge talent that we haven't even seen her best yet, because she hasn't been tested in any of these races. And I'm just very excited to see where she goes next year.
I can't wait. I think she'd be the favorite for the Guineas if they decided to get really ambitious. Probably feels like a Keeneland Ascot route might, a race like the Coronation might be more in fitting with the trainer's more typically conservative pattern when it comes to these horses. But we'll see. And I agree absolutely with what you said about how the style suits. Another important thing is you get a lot of horses early in the season over there, for even at the time of these classic races, that they're just not fully fit coming from the environment, the cold and being turned out in the cold. Basically, they're not going to be up to speed as well as she's going to be up to speed, whether we're talking about a return in May or even in Ascot in June. She still might have a fitness edge. I hope they do something wild. It's going to be so much fun. Craig, star of the Breeders' Cup for you.
Just one thing on Newspaper of Record. I think you also got to keep in mind she handled the soft and yielding, or whatever they want to call it. She handled an off turf easily and looked great. So going overseas, sometimes that's a big question mark. I don't think it will be with her. As far as a star, I would love to pick Accelerate. I mean, his record is incredible. If you look at any other year, winning the 4 big California Grade 1s and the Breeders' Cup, I mean, 9 times out of 10, he would be the guy. But I have to go with Enable. I think we just saw just a really special filly. I mean, a 2-time ARC winner. I mean, just to have her come over here and run was something. And to see her run so well, and her and Magical, she looked beat. I thought Magical had her, and she just dug in. And, it was a football field back to the rest. Granted, I don't know that our horses are all that great when you get into these turf long, 1.5-mile races, but to just put that kind of gap on the field, even with the off turf, it was a special moment, I thought. So she was definitely my star of the day.
It was an all-time Breeders' Cup moment for me. The goosebumps and everything. It was just so fun to see and fun to watch. Dettori and Moore battling it out through the stretch and Enable getting the job done. Very happy to have the opportunity to give her props here. And that's about all the time that we have, gentlemen. I want to thank David Aragona. I want to thank Craig Milkowski. I want to thank the guy we're calling Craig Jr. Is that what his new name is? Craig Gorbanoff, producer Craig, as he's known on this show, for helping us out today. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for listening. We will be back with another show next week. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. May you win all your photos.